My grandmother was one of the few who endorsed completely the concept of change to the European way of life. And my grandfather, as far as that goes, they both agreed that the old ways were over and it was time to get on with the business of living according to the pattern set by the invaders. So they encouraged the children to go outside to residential schools. My mother really bought this doctrine 100%. She lived in a kind of a fantasy world. She wished that she was the offspring of some titled English gentry who had been kidnapped by bad fairies and left on the doorstep of some terrifically aristocratic Haidas who were not really worthy of her, but were as worthy as any Haidas could possibly be. She was very clever. She was a dressmaker, and she had as customers the members of the Spencer family who owned the big department stores in Vancouver and Victoria at that time. She was very hardworking, supported us three kids all during the Depression with very little help from her husband after 1933, accepted no welfare and made it all on her own. And I think that's quite an achievement for a little girl from the little Indian village on the Charlottes. She was married to my father in Smithers. He and Blackjack MacDonald were operating a gambling hell and bar. I think she married him because he was available and white, because they didn't have very much in common. It was a terrible family that I grew up in because none of them knew anything about being a family or raising kids or anything, and it was a strange milieu. My brother, when he was about 20 years old, migrated to Toronto, but he did manage to create a nuclear family down there, marrying a woman who had a son by a previous marriage, and adopting another child, a girl. I lived for 6 years in Victoria, where I was brought up in the model of an English child, as my mother visualized it, down to the kid gloves and the sailor suit and so on. And I went to Alice Carr's kindergarten, Emily Carr's sister, very fashionable. She was another tyrant. You know, we were 4 or 5 years old as kids, and she'd wander up and down with one of those chalk sticks, carrying one of these and rapping us over the knuckles if we strayed over the lines and the little cards she gave us to paint and so. Emily, in the meantime, was splashing away in the back room. The fact of my acquaintance with the Carrs had absolutely no effect whatever on my future artistic achievements, if any.
When Bill was 12 years old, he carved the tea set out of blackboard chalk, painted it with nail polish, and offered it to his younger sister, Peggy.
And I was 28 years old until I actually started doing anything with the Haida forms. Before that, I was radio announcer for a number of years, and continued that until I was nearly 40. But somewhere in there, I managed to learn the jewelry trade and started making jewelry in the Haida tradition. Then the University of British Columbia asked me to come and do a recreation of a section of a Haida village. And that's where I really got acquainted with massive wood carving and totem poles in particular.
I think that illustrates something about the feeling of the native people for the land, that they have this feeling of very close identity with the places from which their people have descended. Tanu is the village, now deserted for 130 years, I think, from which my grandmother came, and where our family roots are traced by the matrilineal system. The Haidas moved away from it because of there was also the smallpox epidemic of 1862, which destroyed 95% of the population of the Charlottes. The survivors consolidated in the two villages, Masset to the north and Skidiat in the central area. And the rest of the villages were left to return to the forest. Tanu at the present time is just a slightly less dense area of forest than that which surrounds it. with a quantity of old rotting beams and totem poles and things lying around on the ground. One of my grandchildren is named after Tanu, and it's a very important place still to us, in spite of the fact that nobody has lived there except Charlie, who's been dead for 130 years. They buried people in mass graves after the smallpox epidemic because they didn't have enough people left to do anything else. The reserve lands are very small compared to the size of the islands, because when the Reserve Commission came around and said, we want to give you some land, they said, well, that's rather strange because we own this land that you're going to give to us, and we also own the rest of the land, and we're not really interested in talking about reducing our holdings of these postage stamps. So they just found out from the Indian agents and the police and the ministers and so on who had fishing camps somewhere and who had a potato farm some other place and who had some claim to the abandoned areas. So most of the abandoned village sites are reserve. But in actual fact, every bit of inhabitable foreshore on the Charlottes was inhabited at some time or another. You can find archaeological evidence of habitation, either temporary or prolonged. And Windy Bay, for instance, is where we are dedicating a smaller house in the traditional Haida architectural style. I mean, it wasn't a village, it was just a single house. But still, it shows use of the area. The history of logging on the Charlottes has not been a very happy one. It started out as selective logging for prime spruce during the early years of the century, and then accelerated during the First World War, where they found that the Queen Charlotte Island spruce was the best for building airplanes from. So there was quite a lot of logging went on since the discovery. At some point or another, somebody took a look at South Moresby region and realized that it was the last stand of virgin timber on the Queen Charlotte Islands that was sort of a self-contained entity, a perfect blend of old forest and small rivers, estuaries, islands, beaches, seal rocks, as well as a very rich ocean area. Richest in the world in one part. There's a place called Burnaby Narrows that contains more protein per square anything than any other place in the world. So it became apparent that South Moresby was a very rare and valuable asset as it was, not as another area to be stripped of its trees. But it was pretty hard to convince the logging interests and the governments. I think the Island Protective Association has been in existence for about 13 or 14 years now. And it's had a very successful career as far as getting its case to the public is concerned. But this has had very little effect on the actual slowing down of the logging, which is been stripping the trees from the islands. The economy is controlled by a very few large companies, mainly the logging companies and mining interests. And they control the governments pretty well. And in the 100 years that the logging has been well established in British Columbia, we have just about eliminated the first growth timber, easily accessible stuff from which we've been making all our money for all these years. It's been a great move to cut it all as fast as possible, with the pious hope that something would grow back on the cut-over lands. I think we should be aware that something has to be done, and done soon, to preserve the forests, or we're going to be the same as the Hebrides or the Mediterranean, which were once heavily wooded and are now, almost call them deserts. There There's not a great deal of game on the Charlottes, mostly deer, which were introduced early part of the century and now abound wherever you go. There's a black bear, and that's about the extent of the big animals, but there are many smaller ones and a great abundance of bird population. Seabirds, shorebirds, and birds who make their nests in the forest itself. The forests are perhaps 12,000 years old and have been there ever since the ice left. Maybe before, because not all of the Charlottes was affected by the ice. And this produces a very strange and wonderful area where the cycle of birth, growth, life and death is very obvious at every place you go. See great trees standing, some of them 10 or 12 feet in diameter and maybe 1,000 years old. Some of them almost return to the earth, long mounds providing nutrients for the new trees which grow up out of the old windfalls. There are many other organisms supported by the basic tree growth. They're fantastic mosses and lichens to begin with. There's, I think, something like 204 species. When the forest floor is covered with moss, it's very firm. You can walk on it very easily, and yet it's as soft as a great carpet. And in the areas where the big trees dominate, there's much open space between them, and walking through this cathedral of living columns is quite easy to do. It is a most profound statement of life that you could find anywhere. It's a wonderful place to see, and this, I suppose, is the main argument to be made for preserving it, that we require, I think, as human beings, we require our sacred groves. They've always been part of almost every group of people, wherever they may live. There is something about the great trees that seems to be necessary to the welfare of the human spirit, if you like. And South Moresby is certainly one of the most beautiful.
In 1980, Bill's most magnificent sculpture, The Raven and the First Man, was completed for the Museum of Anthropology in BC. 1984, Chief of the Undersea World, or the Killer Whale, made of bronze. Another of Bill's creations is erected in front of the Vancouver Aquarium. 1986, the Bank of British Columbia asks Bill to create a full-size canoe for Expo 86 in Vancouver. A canoe of this size had not been built in almost 100 years. Bill, a visionary, insisted on making sure that the canoe would be built in Skidegate. A local team of 6 carvers, led by foreman Jack Stacy Brown, was created. Under Bill's watchful eye, the historical spirit of the past was so present. All the people of Haida Gwaii could feel the love of their ancestors. Several people from different communities offered help to finish the canoe on time. Still in Skidegate, the canoe was launched ceremonially and named Lutas, Wave Eater, by Hazel Stevens, matriarch of Reid's Raven Wolf clan of Tanu. That same year, the spirit of Haida Gwaii, or the Black Canoe, was commissioned by the Canadian Embassy in Washington, D.C., which also gave permission for a second casting purchased by the Vancouver International Airport in 1996. This version has a green finish and is called the Jade Canoe. Haida creatures crowd the canoe, the animal world, and the humans as one. In the mythology of the Haida people, birds and animals have their own history, just like humans. You can see the big bear mother paddling and caring for all the living. In November 1985, 72 people were arrested at the logging blockade on Lyle Island, including several elders. Bill was part of the resistance but was not arrested. Some people were charged and convicted of contempt and given probationary sentences. In 1987, all of Bill's artistic production stopped as he took part in a stand against the BC government's approval of logging on the southern part of Haida Gwaii, South Morse Bay. The Island Protection Society, created by environmental activist Tom Henley and Haida leader Gujau, was on the map. The Haida people and their territory received worldwide public attention. By now, the mounting pressure against the government of Canada and the province of BC led them to sign a memorandum to stop logging on Haida land. In 1993, Gwaii Hannes National Park Reserve and Haida Heritage Site was officially recognized. An agreement was signed that from now on, the national park, a territory of 1,495 square kilometers, would be co-managed by the Haida Nation government and the government of Canada. Finally, the Haida people are free on their own land and in their connection to the sea. The underwater creatures and wonderful plant life, much of which is recognized as medicine, are growing stronger and more beautiful. Bill passed away on March 13, 1998. He had suffered horrible pain from Parkinson's disease for almost 30 years. There were 2 tribute services. The first in Vancouver, where more than 1,000 people came to the Museum of Anthropology, which was like another home for Bill, and where many of his magnificent works are on permanent display. The second service was held in Skidegate, where they say at least 700 people attended. The ceremonies were given by traditional chiefs and people from Haida Gwaii. In his will, it was Bill's wish to have his ashes carried in a traditional carved and painted box, commissioned by Martine, his wife, who supported him from the time they first met until the end of his life. They were chanting and praying as they carried a box of ashes in Lutas, one of his last creations.
Yahweh, way, we are,
The ashes were paddled for 3 days all the way to Tanu, the beautiful small island where his grandmother was born. A sacred place for Bill. He was going to the other side of the world, as he said. When they stopped in Skadans for the night, the wind was blowing strongly from the south. And then the rain came. The next morning, although the sun was shining, the water was still rough from the storm, and Bill's ashes had to ride alone in lutas for the rest of the way to Tanu. The time had come. Bill's long journey was beginning. He was ready. On Tanu, a stone was placed over his grave, bearing the name Iljuis, meaning manly one or princely one. It was Bill's wish that his ashes be partially buried and partially scattered on the banks of Tanu. His memory will live forever.
Ahia